Should go to YouTube. All right, there we go. So let's see here. Actually, there's a duplicate. Yes, we'll leave it as is. And not there, not there, not there. All right, there we go. We'll work with that there. So, welcome to Merged PHP. It is Thursday, May 8th, 2025. And if you're looking for information in the PHP community and high quality talks online, whether live or recorded, from a variety of speakers, funneling in from a variety of PHP user groups in North America, you're in the right place. We have a lot of user groups participating in making sure that we have a consistent talk lineup of a number of speakers, both in the US and abroad. Thanks to all the folks who have participated as user group organizers in the community. So, if you don't already have one of or all of JetBrains' excellent IDEs, whether that is PHPStorm or WebStorm or a number of others, they cost money, but they're worth it. But today, if you want to, shoot an email to Chris Bruck of Atlanta PHP, and you'll be entered in a drawing to get a JetBrains product license for free. This license can be used for PHPStorm, but can also be used for some of their other tools as well, whether that is PyCharm, RubyMine, IntelliJ, etc. So even if you already bought PHPStorm from them, you have a few other options for really excellent software development tooling. These days, I'm doing a lot of Go, and I pity the folks who have to deal with VS Code because Golang actually works better. So we are now well into the release of PHP 8.4. And as of a while back, PHP releases would wind up going end of life or security update only at the end of the year rather than aligned with when they were first released. So it makes it a little bit easier to keep track of things. If you are on PHP 8.0, you should upgrade. That version is already end of life. If your distro is doing security fix backports, then that's great. Otherwise, the PHP group itself is not doing those backports, so you're kind of on your own. 8.1 and 8.2 are being maintained for security fixes only, whereas 8.3 is still under active support, and of course 8.4 is the latest version. You can see information on what's new in PHP 8.4 in previous presentations on the Merge PHP channel. So there are a number of conferences and events, and I'm going to try my hand at moving my, nope. You do not want to. There we go. There are a number of events in the PHP community. A lot of them are outside the US, but PHP Tech is here in the States in just a few weeks in Chicago. I will be attending there. And there's International PHP Conference, there's PHP Day. A lot of these are over in Europe. Laracon is in Denver this year, out toward August. And Longhorn PHP, you might have seen this mentioned at the last Merge PHP meetup, but we are back this year in Austin, October 23rd through the 25th, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. You can just do Friday, Saturday as well. Tickets are not yet available on sale. RCFP is not yet open, but you can go to our website and sign up for email updates, and we will let y'all know as soon as the CFP is open, and then go from there. I expect that we'll be accepting papers or, well, presentation abstracts by the time PHP Tech rolls around. And let's see. There we go. We are on various social networks in some capacity or other, whether that is Twitter. Of course, you're watching this here on YouTube. We are also on the Fediverse at PHPC Social. Merge at PHPC Social there. Eventually, I figure we'll get a Blue Sky account once we figure out how to multicast that. So looking forward to next month. We have Daniel Abernathy, somebody here from the Austin PHP community, presenting on setting PHP up and serving it in a home lab environment. As usual, we will be second Thursday of the month, 6 p.m. Central, 7 Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. So you'll want to tune in then and see what Daniel has to present. If you want to be up on virtual stage, go to mphp.io/speakers or mention us on socials, and we can get you slotted in. Again, we have next month covered, but further out in the year is a little bit up for grabs right now. With that, I am going to turn it over to Jose for talking about HTMX. Let me drop myself off of screen. There we go. Stage. And we'll do this. And then I will drop.
Cool. I think I have control. I'm gonna guess so. Hi everyone. My name is Jose Diaz Gonzalez. To pronounce without the accents or with the accents, as you want. And I'm an off-again, on-again gig PHP core developer. I'm also a CEO of HTMX, and you can be one too. They sell T-shirts online. Today I'm gonna give a talk on, it says right there, PHPScript. Postmodern front-end interactions in PHP. So give me a second while I bring up Keynote and do this correctly. Let's see now. Share my screen. Yeah, that's good. Sure, why not the whole screen? We're going to need the whole screen today. We're going to do some live demos. Hopefully, folks aren't too afraid of that. Let's go. Cool. So this talk again is about HTMX. Going to do a little bit of excavation here. You're going to learn a bit about the history of JavaScript usage in Cake PHP, which is a framework for PHP, as well as how HTMX works and like how it relates to sort of front-end application development for PHP developers. Hopefully, this is introducing some new exciting technology to that you can use in your applications. The original talk of this title is actually HTMX Helper, the revival of the JS Helper. This talk was given previously at CakeFest in Luxembourg, but it's been repurposed for Merge PHP. And it actually doesn't have too much Cake PHP in it, so hopefully that doesn't scare folks away.
By the way, on your screen share, you do have the little banner at the bottom, so probably
that's good.
click through that.
How do I get out of here? Hide. Beautiful. Screen sharing is so difficult these days.
Yep.
There we go.
All right, you're good. Go right ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, like I mentioned, it was previously given at CakeFest Luxembourg. I don't know if this was mentioned before. We have CakeFest in Madrid. It's coming up in October, I believe. Hopefully this talk kind of inspires some of you all to attend CakeFest and learn more about Cake PHP. I've previously given a lot of talks with lots of pictures that I've drawn or pictures I've culled from the internet. This talk will have very few. And in fact, I don't think there are any pictures here. It's a lot of text, a lot of demo, a lot of talking, and hopefully that doesn't bore folks. If you do want to see more hand-drawn interactions, feel free to attend CakeFest and maybe you'll see something else there. I will have a bunch of code blocks splattered here and there just to kind of keep things interesting. Again, it's not going to be super heavy on code, so hopefully a lot of it is really easy for folks to understand. Finally, I want to give a couple disclaimers. Again, this is mostly about the history of like front-end development and Ajax and that sort of thing within Cake PHP, as well as using HTMX with Cake PHP. None of this talk actually describes anything that's officially available with Cake PHP, although I don't think it needs to be necessarily. The original title of the talk talked about HTMX helper. That doesn't really actually exist either. And then again, you don't need to know anything about Cake PHP or even use Cake PHP in your application to get something out of this talk. I'll go over a couple very simple Cake PHP concepts, but they're almost certainly going to have an analog in your framework of choice. I'd love, again, if you try out Cake PHP, but hopefully some of the HTMX stuff seems interesting to you as well. So first off, I want to talk about raffle time. I know that this Merge PHP has their own raffle, but what I will be doing is a little bit separate. I'm going to ask Ian for your help at some point at the end of this talk. I'm giving away one of 3 Cake PHP related elephants. I don't know if you guys can see me. They're here. Whoever wins gets to pick their color, and I'll ship it to you within the wherever you're located. Let me know. The only thing you have to do is be available by the end of the talk. So hopefully you'll be around, and it'll hopefully be fair. The way we're going to do this is via a raffle, like I mentioned here. And I'm just going to pick a number between 1 and the number of folks who are available at the end of the talk. So if you're the only one here, you get a free elephant. And if you're 1 of 10, you have a 1 in 10 chance. But that's kind of what we're going to do at the end of it. So yeah, let's see now. Let's go to a demo. So before I go to the rest of my talk, I'm going to do a little demo. This demo was pre-made because live coding is pretty dangerous, and I don't want to display something terrible like my bank account numbers while I'm in the terminal. So first off, again, there's a little bit of Cake PHP here, but if you're familiar with any modern framework, a lot of this stuff will be pretty similar to what commands you would run. We're going to start by generating a database migration with Cake PHP. You can have pretty simply with the CakeBake command line, you specify the migration name, in this case, create articles, and then you can specify the fields that you want available in your database. In this case, I want a title, content, and a photo URL. I'm also going to run the migrations here. So we have a fully featured migrations package that you can just kind of run your migrations against any database that we support, as well as generating a seed class that we'll use to enter in data for our database. For the purposes of this demo, I'm going to actually be using Faker to generate that seed data. And so you'll need to install that if you were following along with a new Cake PHP application. If you're not familiar with Faker, it allows you to generate fake data, and it'll allow you to generate fake data for a variety of different primitive types, as well as things that are more complex, like potentially credit card numbers or images and that sort of thing. So this is our seed class. Cake PHP allows you to generate seeds. In this case, I'm just going to generate seeds based on picsum to generate like a bunch of images and like some general title content information. And I'm storing that into the database. All right, so pretty straightforward. Again, you can do this in probably your framework of choice, whether that's Laravel or any other framework. So at this point, we can run the migrations. Again, Cake PHP ships with the Cake command line, so we can just run those. We're going to generate the model classes. So that's a table class, which you can use to interact with your database, as well as entity classes that you can use to like actually reference a particular record in a database. We're going to bake controllers, which will have most of the backend logic for us, and we're going to just generate a dummy template for us. So we can look at what this is what I'm going to actually do to the template. So we simply iterate over every single article. I'm showing displaying it in a very generic way, and I have some pagination code at the end. Again, this is pretty straightforward. There's nothing super complex here that I'm doing. The magic here is actually all in the pagination code. So what happens here is when the last article is displayed, we'll generate a special span. So you'll see right there that when that span is revealed or shown in the browser viewport, it'll be triggered via an HX get. Anything here that is as a HTML attribute on the span that is prefixed with HX, those are things that HTMX will kind of just understand and interact with. So in this particular case, the HX get, it'll spawn a get request against that generated URL. It'll then take that response and it'll, using that HX swap, before the end of the articles, which is the target, it'll add in that data, right? And we're also only selecting the .article entities from that response. So when HTMX makes that request, you might respond with an entire HTML page, including the layout of your application. And HTMX will kind of just ignore that and show what it is that you want to display specifically. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. And if not, feel free to comment and I'll go over that after the channel or after the talk. We're additionally going to simplify our layout. Cake PHP generates a pretty comprehensive HTML layout. I'm just going to ignore most of that for the purposes of this demo. In this case, I am including some CSS for interacting or for displaying my page how I want it. And I'm also including the HTMX rendered JS file. You can, of course, reference something on a CDN if you want, or do like wherever you want to reference. In my case, I just don't want to depend on that for the demo, so we're not going to use that. So now I'm going to go to the live demo. Hopefully you guys can see my screen. Let's go to the demo. So this is my page. This is all, it's not in Latin, unfortunately. Or, well, I guess it is in Latin. These are all the articles that are being returned from the database. Sorry about that. That's a debug kit. Display some information about the application. So it's a pretty straightforward landing page. We're just generating some articles and displaying an image. If you scroll to the bottom, in many cases for an application, you'll see there's some pagination links that will display. In this case, HTMX allows us to kind of ignore this. And so when we go to the bottom, you'll see those extra entries were entered in. These entries were generated a couple months ago, and so some of the images are out of date, and so they may not load. But generally speaking, you'll get kind of an infinite scroll experience as you go along, right? So pretty straightforward. Hopefully that's something that you can use in your applications. Going back to my talk, there's a couple other things that we can do here. Again, as I mentioned before, with with HTMX, we're making that GET request to your server. And most frameworks, when they get a GET request, they're just going to respond with the entire response, including the layout that you might have had. In our case, we might not want to do that because it's just extra data that we don't need to display. The layout doesn't really have anything that we would display for a user for an HTMX request because we're only really concerned about the article divs that respond from there. So one minor optimization we can do is we can disable the layout. And again, if you're in any other framework, there's probably a way to do that. Well, you can basically just check to see, does your request have an HX request or does your request have an HX request header? And if it does, then you can just disable the layout, right? We can also add this to a more central place in your application. So in Cake PHP's case, there's an initialize function that every single controller has. And you can just place that in that controller and then kind of go off for all of your controller actions. We'll just kind of handle that. One thing that I thought about while I was writing this talk was making something a little bit more automatic for a lot of this logic. And in the case of Cake PHP, we rely on composer packages that are, in some cases, structured a little bit special and provide plugin functionality to Cake PHP. As I was busy writing the talk back in June, I noticed that a developer in the community actually wrote something for for HTMX in Cake PHP. So thanks out there to Juhani Arunan from Home Run, who released this plugin. So basically, the way you would use it is you install a plugin via Composer as you would do in any other framework. Cake PHP has a way to load plugins in, so it's sort of its initialization process. So you can do that via Cake plugin load, and then you load the particular component which handles a lot of the request management in Cake PHP in your app controller initialize. What I mentioned before, again, it's kind of like a core place in your application where you can start stuff that happens for every single request, for every single action. So again, it's all pretty standard Cake PHP stuff, just including it here for completeness. In this particular case, the one change that we would make is instead of checking to see if the request header exists, we just check to see if the request is of type HTMX. Right. So again, this is just kind of reducing that boilerplate and making it a little more Cake PHP friendly. Right. The other thing that this plugin kind of introduces is the idea of using view blocks for managing what gets displayed on your various responses. So view blocks are a way to kind of just say, hey, I only want to cherry pick this portion of my template, and that's the only thing I want to display. It's a pretty neat way to kind of say, hey, I have a generic template that gets embedded in my layout, but that template has maybe a couple different sections here, and really this is the only germane portion for this particular display of that. And so that allows you to kind of reuse that template across multiple actions, if you will. And then the template block corresponds with the HX target that we previously specified in that span. And because of how HTMX kind of handles requests, we get that as part of the request headers to our application. And so in this particular case, we can say, all right, fine, we know that we want that target, which is specified before was articles. That's being specified already as a header. And so I can just automatically pull that in. And so again, this is something that you can do for many of your controller actions. Just kind of copy paste it wherever you need it to, or you can put it somewhere more central, like your initialize function. And finally, going back to our template, we're going to again iterate over our articles and kind of print them out. I've omitted some of that in the middle, but you'll notice there are two different sections here, or two new bits. There's one where it starts articles and then fetches articles. So this kind of is just starting a view block and then storing that somewhere. And then again, you can now print it however you want in your application. Again, it's pretty useful if you're reusing that. If you're using that block over and over and over in your app, you can just kind of stuff that in one portion of your template and then reuse it elsewhere. If you're familiar with Jinja in Python, this is pretty similar concept to their view block implementation. So going back to a demo. This is that same application, this is that same application page. Instead of now we're using this view block methodology, and we're also using the HTMX helper that we got, or the HTMX component that we got from that plugin. So pretty straightforward. Again, the logic here is basically the same. We scroll down and we can see automatic infinite pagination as we did in the previous example. So not too many things changed here. It's just kind of like making it a little bit simpler for folks to kind of interact with. And then going back to my talk, this is the last part of this particular demo. An alternative to view blocks, which I think is a little bit heavyweight to kind of modify your application, is for us to use an element to render the view. So if you're not familiar with Cake PHP, elements are kind of like snippets of templates that you would reuse across multiple either actions or across multiple controllers, right? In this particular case, I am placing my element and templates element HTMX articles index.php, and that's just the guts of the iteration over the articles array. And then our template file just becomes this, pretty straightforward, just rendering that template inside of, or rendering that element inside of the template. Nothing very special here. And then finally, again, we can now go back to our controller. This is, again, based on the previous HTMX integration. The two things that are changing here is that I'm setting the template path to element. Cake PHP, like any other framework, automatically sets the template path to something that matches your controller. In this case, it would have been articles. Because I want to reuse a template as an element as the template for the page, I can just specify that template path and then specify the template to use. This method, again, allows us to bypass the rest of that template, which in this case isn't that much, but it may be in your application when you're interacting with, like when you're generating pages, there's a lot of logic in there, and you might not want to go through all of that logic. So it's pretty useful kind of way to just display what it is that we want for the HTMX requests. I'm going to skip this live demo just because it's the same thing as the previous demos. We're just going to have infinite pagination. So cool. The first part of that talk is done. Hopefully that gives you kind of a taste of what HTMX is and how you can use it in your Cake PHP application. Again, if this was at the conference, I would have given a live raffle there. Unfortunately, we're only going to have one at the end of the talk. I just want to have a brief intermission here. So cool. So now that I've given the demo, I'm going to go back in time. A lot of this is going to be about the history of JavaScript again and how you use it in PHP frameworks. Since I'm unable to talk about history objectively, I'm going to be speaking from my own experiences. If I embellish a little bit or if something sounds wrong, feel free to correct me after the talk, preferably via email, where I can nervously avoid responding to you, just like I would for any of my consulting gigs. So in 2004, 2005, I was still a teenager trying to build applications with Joomla, OpenRealty, WordPress. If anyone here remembers Dynamic Drive, I probably am not the only one who was trying desperately to ensure that some random internet script from there or Experts Exchange worked on Internet 4 or 5, right? So this was Dynamic Drive, if anyone doesn't remember. It's a pretty great website. Again, always trying to find something that would allow me to build applications a little bit more simply and easily. I actually checked on the website pretty recently, and it hasn't changed too much. Some of the GIFs have disappeared, but what can I do about that? And maybe a little bit of the color scheme change, but I wouldn't change anything either for that website. At the time, in 2004, 2005, the most I ever actually did on the front end was dynamic HTML, right? You could write like a 15-line function that would let you click on a certain DOM element and then slide it up or hide it or slide it out or expand the menu or something similar to that. I didn't really understand what was going on, and mutating that script was close to impossible, even though it was just 15 lines of code. JavaScript was something that wizards and witches wrote, because you had to use magic, honestly, in order to make your code work across multiple different browsers. Again, we're talking about a time when we cared about Internet Explorer 4 and Internet Explorer 5. Firefox was kind of a thing back then. You had to worry about the different browsers, and not only different browsers, but again, different versions of browsers. and different versions of browsers across different operating systems, as well as different devices, right? CSS was kind of in a similar state of terror. Um, we didn't really have Stack Overflow for asking questions or Discord or anything like that. Answers were usually hidden behind paywalls on websites like Experts Exchange, or required knowing how to use Usenet or online groups in order to ask these folks who like really understood what was going on. Um, and again, if you wanted live answers, you had to spin up an IRC client, figure out what the best server was and what the channel it is that you wanted to uh, ask a question on, and then hope someone would answer your question while you were awake and you had your client connected. Or if they answered at a later time, that they had scroll back enabled, right? Today we have Discord and Slack, and we have other like options online, and those are frankly a godsend. We just didn't have those at the time. So 2005 came, and we saw a couple interesting developments. The first was the rise of Ajax through the Prototype JavaScript framework. Prototype and a lot of other frameworks like it extended the DOM, making it easier for us to create dynamic interactions against HTML with a single line of code. So people will notice that recurring theme in regards to where some of the developments I'll mention come from. Prototype came from Sam Stevenson of Ruby on Rails fame. It was created again to provide a simpler way for Rails developers to create interactive applications. So a lot of this stuff comes from Rails. Thank you, Rails, for existing. We probably wouldn't have front-end development as it exists today without you guys. It's quite successful, if you guys remember, if anyone remembers the website. And it spawned a couple different frameworks and tools on top of it and adjacent to it, right? Anyone who used Prototype was also likely to use Scriptaculous, which provided animations, drag and drop, Ajax, and a bunch of other really useful utilities built in. Using these were a really, really good way to pad your bank account when you were billing your client, because you could make something that looked kind of snazzy and say, hey, this was an extra, $10 on your script or $100 or whatever it was. jQuery, which is what many folks are familiar with today, from John Resnick, came out about a year later. I do remember it fixing a lot of issues in Prototype, mainly not monkey patching the DOM and being a bit more performant when working against large numbers of elements. So if we were talking about an infinite scroll page and you scroll long enough, all of those elements are still on your page, and if you had to interact with all of them, jQuery was kind of a godsend for that. The other thing that really helped along with was abstracting the APIs for cross-browser interactions. Today, we're really spoiled in that a lot of the JavaScript, or ECMAScript, as folks might be more familiar with, a lot of the libraries there are really standardized. And at the time, this wasn't the case. You could have a function that did two separate things on two different browsers, even on the same browser, but two different versions. And so jQuery, when it came along, really, really helped a lot with that. There was another framework that I didn't really use too often, MooTools. It provided DOM manipulation and interactivity via MoveFX. Again, I didn't really use it too much. It did provide like a very nice object-oriented programming model that I think really heavily influenced a lot of the early full-stack JavaScript frameworks, though. The equivalent here, I think, is kind of, for MooTools at least, or for jQuery, is for Cake PHP or Laravel, a lot of these modern PHP frameworks, in that they create drivers for things like caching or queuing or data store access. As a developer, you really only need to learn one API, and it more or less works everywhere, on every single server, on a bunch of different PHP versions, or even different PHP implementations. We could once again avoid needing to load up our site on 15 different browsers and kind of checking to see, like, does my website load as I expect it to, or does it fade in properly? Mostly, anyways. Honestly, the promise of write once and load everywhere never really came to fruition. The unfortunate thing is that developers have been fighting browser implementers for about 30 years now. And interactivity really requires knowledge on how the DOM works in particular browsers in order to be performant. Abstractions could only bring us so far, and the developers still needed to know which selectors worked where. If you remember early browsers, selectors for like the next element, for instance, weren't always uniformly implemented. and which browsers implemented rounded corners and what prefixes you needed for a particular CSS, or if you even needed JavaScript to do that, as well as even like censoring a div. A lot of this stuff is kind of just like browser specific. Um, so getting back to the topic, about how Cake PHP kind of interacts with all of this. As everyone kind of knows, Cake PHP is the best framework. I'm not going to take any no's for that, and only implements the best, absolute best code. So of course, we saw that our awesome user base was having trouble building these interactive applications and decided to build out an Ajax helper. And so, for anyone unfamiliar with Cake PHP, helpers are they're part of our templating layer. You can use them to build out forms, more complex HTML arguments or fragments, and generally just like consolidate complex logic for your application, so you don't have that littered across multiple templates and just have PHP on one side and then mostly HTML on the other side. So in days long past, we had the Ajax helper to provide functionality like autocomplete, drag and drop, sorting on the front end, that sort of thing. Developers would write JavaScript as strings in PHP, send them off to the browser, and then pray that to your $ deity that the browser loaded everything correctly. The Ajax helper itself, and again, this is going back to 2004, 2005 time, was built against Scriptaculous for its front-end interactivity. So users could, of course, supplement that with their own custom JavaScript callbacks, for example, here, to show a paging or like to kind of like iterate over your page. And the first decade of, of the new millennium was kind of a simpler time. And I don't think like people really understood that you could do really complex stuff on the front end. Again, you still kind of needed to do things that were browser specific, and the community was kind of moving towards jQuery. So we knew that this implementation kind of had hit its limits. So slightly before I joined the Cake core team, Cake PHP 1.3 was released for front-end development. It was pretty interesting for Cake PHP developers because we provided now an abstraction on top of the Ajax helper. We called it the JS helper, and you could interact with a bunch of different libraries and implementations on the front end in order to provide that interactivity. So you no longer had to depend on Scriptaculous if that wasn't your JavaScript framework of choice. You could go and say, hey, like I really like this jQuery stuff, and most of my other scripts are in jQuery, so I just want to use like the interactions that Cake PHP is familiar with in jQuery as well. It's pretty neat. I love this. Again, I had written a very small amount of JavaScript at this point, and it was mostly just very terrible jQuery. And I could finally understand a lot of the JavaScript that was being even generated by the framework, and not worry about like namespace issues in prototype as I had to previously. Like, am I using jQuery properly, or is this interacting with prototype? I didn't really need to care about that. As a developer, this was great. I'd also like to take that there wasn't really anything actually stopping me from using jQuery before. In fact, I mostly just stayed away from the JS helper because while it bootstrapped a lot of the more complex front-end code, for me, there was always kind of an edge case where I needed full control of the interaction anyways, right? It's really hard to interact with a lot of these front-end frameworks in a very deep way unless you are sitting down with that JavaScript developer who's writing the framework and saying, hey, how do we interact with that from the framework side, from the server side? So for instance, drag and drop did work on some lists, but also we didn't need to render that list in the first place, and so that was kind of a pain. And so like maybe we added it later as part of like clicking on a button. This was something that you kind of needed to hack in, and maybe the drag and drop needed to wait until some timer hit. Maybe like you needed to wait until some Ajax requests responded before you allowed folks to kind of drag and drop things, and you couldn't really do that with the built-in integration on the Cake PHP side. So it's kind of difficult in some cases to kind of interact with this as a developer, right? So again, I would kind of rarely use the helper, or would implement something really, really simple with it and then move on, and then maybe even replace it at a later date when it got more complex. And I think a lot of the community kind of felt the same way, not just in Cake PHP or in the PHP world, but just kind of across all backend frameworks. So now we're going to go to another HTMX demo to showcase how easy it is to use HTMX. One thing I'd like to stress here is that HTMX is a progressive technology. You add little bits of it to your application to make the overall experience a lot better for your users. You're not really changing too much of how you build applications here. So one thing that like a lot of people build in their application is a search page, right? You want to search for something in your application, in this case, articles, or maybe in your case, it's posts or comments or images or whatever it happens to be. Typically, you're searching a database. You might be filtering those requests and then returning the relevant results to users. So in this case, we're going to start by creating a very simple search page. It's going to have pagination as well. If you're familiar with Cake PHP, again, this is kind of just going to query the database for our articles. It's going to create that query object. We're going to paginate over that query object to generate the article array, and then we're going to set that for the view. Pretty simple, straightforward. The default index page just paginates, but I also wanted to add a little bit more functionality to my queries or to my search page. I wanted to create a custom finder. In this case, in the Cake PHP world, when you call find, it'll return a query object, and you can mutate that query object to add any constraints on your query. So in this particular case, I'm just adding a light query. This is actually a pretty old way to add a light query. I'm pretty sure there's a helper for this that like properly handles, adding the query to the query object, but it works just fine, and we properly escape things in the ORM. Otherwise, it's pretty straightforward, just kind of like an extra addition to my search object. Finally, I'm also going to add the HTMX logic that I added before. In this case, I'm also using an element. The one interesting thing I'm doing here is I'm allowing us to specify the element as a header, right? And this will then allow us to go and then say, hey, in the integration on the template side to specify that header, and then use that when I'm requesting the template. Of course, in a more complex application, you might whitelist the or allow only certain elements to be used, so that way folks aren't kind of traversing your path or showing something that they shouldn't be showing for the elements, but it's kind of up to you. And then to skip a bunch of this work, I'm actually just going to generate that template, the index search page. And you can obviously use an existing template if you want. Feel free to modify it. The one extra thing I'm actually going to do to my template is I'm going to add a form control. This will allow me to search for that query. So in the previous demo, we used the trigger that when the element was revealed, then we would trigger HTMX, right, and have that get request happen. In this particular case, the trigger is not that. The trigger is when I have changed the input field, and it has a delay of 500 milliseconds. So this makes it not only responsive to my search queries, but also ensures that I'm not spawning too many requests for my application. And again, HTMX provides a ton of different integration points for your application, and they're kind of all just controlled by HTML attributes. I definitely recommend if folks are interested to kind of go in and see what those look like on their website. I've also added a couple extra things to this request. For example, the HX headers, like I specified before, I can specify multiple headers for that request and have them just kind of injected into the HX get. In this particular case, I am specifying cake element as search. There's a couple different ways you can do this in your application, and you could abuse this to, again, go into a different code path in your app. So I definitely recommend if you do this to kind of have more guards in your controller logic to make sure that you're not requesting the wrong thing. We also want the URL to change as typing in query strings, and we can do that via HX replace URL, right? This allows the user to kind of have a history of what they have searched for in the URL bar. So when they press back, it'll actually bring them to the last query that they made, versus just bringing them to a completely different page. So it's a pretty useful way to add or to mutate the browser history without really writing any JavaScript. Right. Cool. The other thing here is that like the entire request can be modified via the HX request attribute. We can use confirmation modals or even disable HTMX completely for a particular element if we wanted to. with very few exceptions, HTMX allows us to modify pretty much everything with just HTML attributes. So you don't really need to learn anything but HTML in order to integrate with HTMX. In this particular example, I'm printing out that HTML with a Cake PHP helper, but we could have just as easily done that via just a simple form input div or element. One thing, again, I really want to impress upon folks is that there is a JavaScript API into HTMX. Like I mentioned before, while everything is modifiable via HTML attributes, you can also just go in very deep and modify HTMX directly. At CakeFest Luxembourg, one of the other core developers, Mark Story, actually showed how we can use this to completely avoid JavaScript in your application by using just the HTMX API. So if you build a Cake PHP application, you can again pretty much easily build that with HTMX and have this extra logic kind of come in and enhance the experience for users without too much extra information. So again, with our previous example, I showed how to use an element for my iteration. In this particular case, I'm doing the same thing. Could have used a view block or really any other method, but it's pretty straightforward. I don't think that there isn't too much to explain here, hopefully. So now I'm going to go to the demo for this. Ooh, so here's my demo, lovely search demo. I am displaying elements on the page or articles for my database. I have pagination here as well. And I can go in and then say, all right, fine, Dolor. And that'll create a request, Dolores. Right. In this particular case, I'm not replacing the pagination at the bottom, although you can do that. And you can have HTMX replace multiple elements on your page from the response that you get from the server. Or you cannot. In this particular case, I'm not doing that. It's kind of up to you. Again, if you go back into your browser history, you'll notice that that's changing. There's a couple of bugs here, but it does change your browser state, so it's pretty neat. Let's come back. Cool. So raffle time. Just kidding. This would, again, if we were live, I would give away a PHP elephant. And since we're not, I can only apologize. If I didn't have to worry about shipping for everyone, I would 100% give away 3 elephants today, but there's only one. So please stick around till the end and you'll get an elephant. So if we go back to using the JS helper, I think it was kind of a source of frustration for both developers and the core maintainers. A lot of folks were confused on how to use it or how to do things that are slightly more complex than you would use that was in the manual. They might even forget to include a particular library or some option that would make those Ajax elements kind of drop into the DOM. And it wasn't really an interesting area for maintainers to kind of interact with. If you're familiar with any of the modern integrations from PHP frameworks to front-end frameworks, they have an entire developer or entire development team working on these things. It's not something that the core developers of frameworks necessarily always work on. And in our case, it wasn't something that the core developers really wanted to work on. It just wasn't an interesting portion of the code base. And so we kind of had to move on. And in previous years, or we previously removed the Ajax helper in the 2.0 release. And so in the 3.0 release, or sometime in the 2.0 release, we decided to remove the JS helper in Cake 3. It just wasn't, again, something that we wanted to maintain. It wasn't something that the development community or the user community really understood how to use. It kind of confused a lot of folks, and there were a lot of better alternatives out there in 2010. And one of the things that was kind of interesting is around this time, a lot of folks are starting to use full-featured JavaScript web frameworks, not things like jQuery or MooTools or Prototype, but really more powerful front-end frameworks. The iPhone came out in 2007, and so a lot of folks were starting to write more interesting mobile web applications. There was this phrase called SOLOMO, social, local, mobile, and that was the slogan for a lot of app developers, right? And it had a lot of important implications. So whenever I write a web app, I typically don't have a ton of interactivity, maybe a drop down here or an Ajax call there or some animation in the corner. And this kind of builds up over time. And then you have a ton of scripts that kind of are falling over each other, and they're all fighting to control a single DOM element. and that kind of blocks the users from doing simple things on your website, like, I don't know, buying something, right? So it's pretty limiting, right? And I think a lot of the applications out there don't necessarily need a full stack framework, right? If you're writing some of these more complex applications, sure, but in many cases they're not necessary. Um, and when they're not necessary, I think we need to be careful about building these like kind of more bespoke frameworks in their place. In the case of Cake PHP, we built the JS helper and the Ajax helper, and those were bespoke frameworks on their own right. Mobile applications or early mobile applications like Foursquare and Twitter were similar to that. They didn't need a ton of interactivity because we were fighting stuff like not having good signal strength or even not having like 2G internet and using underpowered devices, but they did need something, right? And I think the need for some in between structure here is what kind of had the death knell for the JS helper and similar you know, patterns like it. I think developers kind of looking for something a little bit easier to interact with than a 1,000-line JavaScript page or script that like and 1,000-line files that were kind of floating all over your application, and maybe something in kind of a familiar package to the frameworks that we're used to today. One of the first really interesting frameworks in this space was jQuery Mobile, and it provided a really rich native-looking UI and a better overall mobile experience. And in fact, one of the first mobile apps that I built was a ticketing app using jQuery Mobile. It's pretty neat, and it actually ended up bringing like 30% of our traffic through like mobile devices, iPhone, Android, and that sort of thing. And actually pushed our company at the time to start building these native mobile experiences. Another early framework I think was Backbone.js, and Backbone.js was an MVC framework that was built on top of Underscore.js. Underscore.js is still out there. I think probably vanishingly fewer and fewer folks are using it now. But it was kind of like a lightweight version of jQuery. It really just allow you to interact with a couple DOM selectors and like kind of do functional programming against elements and that sort of thing. But it was super easy for backend developers, right? If you knew Cake PHP and if you knew Rails or Symfony or what have you, you could probably pick up Backbone. It's just an MVC framework, just like any other MVC framework. And in fact, like that ticketing company that I was working at, we transitioned from that jQuery mobile site to Backbone.js and had a much more performant experience for our users, right? We probably could have done the same stuff in jQuery mobile or even just jQuery, but I didn't know what I was doing. That would have been 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000 lines of code in a single script, and maybe it wouldn't have actually have been as performant at the end of the day. And in the vein of recurring themes, another framework that's sprouted from the Rails community was Ember.js. I think Ember and Backbone really did push forward Web 2.0. Ember's famous killer app was essentially a PowerPoint in the browser, which today might not be super interesting because we have WASM and that sort of thing on the front end. But back in 2010, 2011, this wasn't something that was really possible at all. And I think that's underappreciated by today's general JavaScript developers. We had to basically work on Raspberry Pis, and that was the most powerful kind of computer that we had at the time. Whereas today, a Raspberry Pi is something that you can buy for $5, $10. So to summarize, the front end community was really rallying towards their own frameworks, right? And on the Cake PHP side, which is what I'm talking about, we really didn't have a place for JavaScript, the JS helper in modern app development. The interactions abstracted didn't quite make sense for the level of complexity that folks were going with their application code. Or still, there wasn't really a good abstraction for newer JavaScript frameworks that we could implement that made sense, right? Like there wasn't anything that we could do and say, hey, like we're gonna build a Backbone.js integration. Backbone.js is a good framework in and of itself. It doesn't need an integration. The only really good answer would have been to write our own front-end framework. And I'm aware of that happening in other frameworks, but we just didn't have the time and the resources for that. So for better or worse, we decided to remove it in the Cake PHP 3.0 release. So again, most of this talk has been going over ancient history, and I'm about to skip about 10 years of front-end framework development. The rise of Node.js, server-side, JavaScript, node modules that take up half your disk space, we could talk about this forever and never really actually get to, things that are germane to this talk. And as I said, there's a couple good framework options out there today. Ember.js exists, Vue.js, you can use React, or you can use Next.js. In the same way that I chose CakePHP because it was a 5-minute tutorial that made me feel like I had superpowers, the front end framework I think that you pick should be influenced by probably some random blog post that a developer writes that makes you feel like you have superpowers. It makes you feel like you're super productive in that framework. So this talk, at 100%, if you need to pick a full stack framework, I'm not going to tell you what to pick. It's kind of up to you. Regardless of what framework you pick, you'll largely have the same issues that you would have with a backend framework, just with a twist. To make it easy to visualize, I'm going to talk about a standard content management system as an example. You need a login page, a way to log out, some way to manage content, user management, etc. Coding all that logic in the front end will probably mean that you're building an API and rendering based on responsive from that API, whether a user is logged in, whether they have content, etc. You'll be rewriting that logic twice. You'll be writing the routing logic twice, once in your backend application for those API calls, and once in your front end application to know how to respond to things. And likely actually duplicating a lot of the validation code so that folks aren't submitting bad code from the front end, but also so that your backend isn't like potentially allowing bad input. And so you can, make your application more responsive, allow yourself to skip API calls and that sort of thing. So what I'm getting at is that like when you're building an application today, you're almost certainly building it twice. And you kind of need to because your front end and back end frameworks are usually not that tied closely together. And it's difficult and or sometimes impossible to expose that complex logic from the back end into a completely new language. You can transpile certain things, but at some point there is a limit and certain kinds of interactions just need to stay on one side or the other. That extra duplication time extends into extra development time and introduces more places where you have bugs or confusing logic. And every time I've encountered this, the front end team usually starts or eventually starts writing more and more server side code to reduce the potential differences between the code bases. Is this maybe interesting work? Yes, if you want more node on your server. Is this a good use of your developer time? It depends on if you care about developing your product, honestly. Did your CMS need to be built in React? If it's an internal panel, admin panel, probably not, or almost certainly not. I think what's important here is to really consider the business context of what we're building. In some cases, we do need a 100% reactive front end framework. I previously mentioned working on a ticketing app. We were rendering stadium charts and stadium seating charts that refreshed every single time you panned and zoomed across the page. And doing that with a full page refresh would have been a terrible user experience. No one would use that website. We wouldn't have made payroll, and I probably would have been fired if I had tried to ship that into production. And then there were applications where introducing a front end framework overcomplicated is one such tool. An admin tool that manages your application releases probably doesn't need to have GraphQL backend API and a React front end web application. As you develop your applications in the future, I'd like really challenge you to consider whether or not some of the more modern practices are really necessary for you, or whether or not you can just kind of go with the flow and use something that's just like your server-side template engine and kind of introduce things on top of that. So let's say we don't want or need a front-end framework. Do frameworks like CakePHP provide a good enough experience today to allow you to build something with a little bit of interactivity, like for something like a content management system? I'd say that out of the box, no, especially not with the removal of, on CakePHP side, the Ajax helper and the JS helper. But I don't think that necessarily means that you can't do that. Making a simple Ajax request on your form is pretty straightforward, as I showed before. You just disable the layout and respond kind of with the correct view. Similarly, you can render just the items from autocomplete and respond with that with a few lines of JavaScript. Doing so, if we're just writing that on our own, gets us into a ton of awful patterns that I've mentioned before, where we either are replicating logic in PHP and JavaScript, or writing half of a JavaScript framework, which is kind of what we want to avoid, or we have inscrutable code that's thousands of lines long that govern how we interact with the page and like how users kind of interact with your application. I think we can do better and we should do better. both for ourselves and our fellow developers. So if we want to stick with Cake PHP, but we also want some interactivity in our applications and don't necessarily want to introduce a full stack front end framework, we need to choose some library like jQuery or use a framework on top of it. But the framework we choose doesn't actually need to be one that requires us to write JavaScript. And so finally, the meat and potatoes of this talk. With HTMX, we can lightly decorate our existing views to progressively add the interactivity where it matters. The demos I've shown in this talk have been written with very minimal changes to the Cake PHP framework. It's all pretty much generic HTML with some extra attributes. Other frameworks have methods to do this to varying degrees. Rails was actually one of the first to provide interactivity via turbo links, and today they have turbo frames, strata, and stimulus. Laravel has hotwire and inertia, and I'm sure there's something else that I'm not familiar with. And other frameworks have similar things. Does Cake PHP need an official integration with some library or framework? I think it might help adoption. And if you're familiar with Laravel, if you're familiar with Rails, you know that it really does help that the framework has an integrated front end kind of framework available. But Cake PHP and other frameworks don't really stop you from doing that. In the world of Cake PHP, we're kind of unopinionated about what framework or what front end framework you use and how you do your front end development, because there are frankly a lot of different ways to do the same thing. But if you're looking for something really, really lightweight, I think HTMX is the way to do it. So I'm gonna have a demo. This is my probably last demo, or is it my last demo? A common use case in an application is to have a long running process that's running in the back end and keeping a user up to date on the status. Maybe you're uploading an image or you're processing a CSV or something similar. Avoiding this in the browser is important because we don't want to have timeouts to occur or to tie the actual work in the user's browser to what's happening on the server side. A common way to kind of avoid this is to use a queue. And in the Cake PHP world, we can use the queue plugin for that. The work gets processed on some message bus, and then the status gets displayed back to the user in some fashion. So for this demo, I'm not actually going to be building a queue job just because it's not super necessary for the demo, but we will be polling the Cake PHP app for the status of something. In fact, we're going to be polling it via HTMX and then showing off the results in the UI. I'm going to be building the polling site for the raffle where I'm giving away one of these elephants. So to start, I'm going to build my raffle controller. Pretty straightforward. It's just going to be an empty controller with no actions in there. Next, I'm going to add a very simple index action. For this demo, I'm going to be using the old default layout that ships with Cake PHP. It's not actually called old default. I just renamed it earlier in my talk. The view for this is pretty straightforward. This form will allow us to pick a minimum and maximum number to randomly choose from. It gets submitted as a post request by specifying an HTMX post attribute. The response is written to the .winner element, and there's a swap of the contents from the server onto the winner element. HTMX, again, provides a bunch of different ways to swap contents in the front end. Previously, I used before end, but in this, and if you leave it unspecified, it's just swapping the inner HTML. You can even add fade in or fade out or other kinds of animations to that swap. Other than not having a URL on this form, it's pretty much the same way as you would build any other form in Cake PHP. Previously, this would hit I specified this would hit the start picker action. So this is our start picker action. It's also pretty straightforward. I'm essentially just getting, I'm going to respond with the HTML we need and nothing else. I'm disabling the layout, although we could have disabled it in our layout based on checking to see if this was an HTMX request. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set those min-max values for the view. It's pretty straightforward. Our template, we're going to have a long polling mechanism for requesting that information. Long polling is a pretty old but tried and true method of fetching results from a web server. HTMX also supports server-sent events or WebSockets via extensions to the library. While we could build that in a PHP application, sometimes they're not as trivial, or you might need another server. And so for this demo, just to make it simple, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to use long polling, but you can do that if you want. The template spits out a div that triggers the get request. So that's the HX get to our choose winner action. We've added the query string arguments in HX vals. That's the min and max. These could have been added to the HX get request directly, but I chose to use this method to display that HTMX has a way to add extra query string values, in a special way without like modifying that URL. It's important that you can also use JavaScript for this in order to build a more dynamic query arguments if you're not using an HTML helper or if you're writing just straight HTML directly in your application. The trigger in this case happens every 2 seconds. And in previous examples, it was on key up or it was on viewport scroll. Like I mentioned before, HTMX triggers are pretty numerous. This is the third one I've shown in these demos, and they cover quite a wide variety of common use cases. If you have something that isn't covered, you can just fall back to JavaScript for figuring out when you should trigger an action. And then finally, here's our choose winner action. So this goes back to our controller. In this case, we're setting the min and max as view variables. So that way, if we don't have a winner, they're just set again. And we're also we're randomly picking a winner in half of the cases. So sometimes we're going to make a request and we'll get a winner, and sometimes we won't. HTMX can have the server side long polling stopped by setting a special header. And in this particular case, we're using that component to set the header. But you could have done that just by modifying the request object in your PHP framework of choice. The template file for the choose winner action is also pretty simple. If we have a winner, we're going to print it out. If we don't have a winner, we're just going to display that we're still waiting for a winner. And so with that, we're at the final demo. And I'm going to ask you to swap with me or tell me how many people are in the stream right now.
All right.
Start with 1. Hopefully it's not more. It's not just 1. In which case you win.
All right. 13 people.
Great. All right. I'm going to do this in alphabetical order. So whoever is whatever position in that in the list is going to get this. I'm going to allow Ian to select that, and then that user can confirm with Ian after the fact. As to both,
Is up to 14 now?
it's up to 14.
Yep.
Great. Awesome. So I'm just going to select a winner. Again, this is the demo that I just kind of went over. This hopefully it's going to poll every 2 seconds. We might not. Oh, we got a winner. So user 11, can we confirm who that is?
Checking. Still checking. Do you undo that, Logan? No idea. All right. Everybody post in a comment, and the 11th person will get it.
Sounds great. Anyways, thanks for attending my talk. I do want to emphasize before I let go that providing interactivity in your application doesn't really need an entire framework. In many cases, you might not even need to write any JavaScript. And for better or worse, frameworks like PHP don't need to revive a JavaScript integration like the JS helper. For HTMX, you can build very delightful experiences for your users. So one last thing I'd like to say is thank you to all of the JavaScript framework and library developers out there, both past and present, for making a lot of the stuff that we're doing today really simple and really easy. So that'll be it. Thanks, y'all. I think we're good.
Thanks, Jose. Great talk. Yeah, I'm killing the stream now.